I mean, can we really talk about basketball when the Pitt football team is ranked? They're 5-0. They're welcoming Cal to Acrisure Stadium for the first time as a conference opponent. And, absolutely huge game coming up on Saturday. Is it possible that we could sit here and talk about basketball when they don't play a game for another month? Yeah, it is possible. And as a matter of fact, it's not only possible, it's likely. And I mean, it's not even likely. It's guaranteed, because we are going to talk a little bit of Pitt basketball here on a Wednesday morning. I know it's football season. Football has a whole lot going on, and there's a lot for us to dig into on that side, and I think we have been and will continue to do so, picking up again tomorrow. But we talked to Jeff Capel yesterday. Jeff Capel had held a press conference yesterday, his first one of the season, really. I think we talked to him in like August, and now we talked to him yesterday, and I think we'll probably get some players next week and start having some more of that basketball content filtering in. And the more I thought about it yesterday, after got done talking to Capel and sat down to record this video, the more I thought about it, I was like, you know what? I got stuff I want to say about basketball. There's some basketball topics on my mind. I got a lot of football topics on my mind too, certainly. And hopefully you dug some of the stuff we talked about yesterday, some of the outstanding individual players and the red zone stats. And I wrote about that on Panther-Lair.com yesterday as well. So hopefully you check that article out, because we went even deeper on the numbers than I did on the Morning Pitt. But for right now, even though we got a football slideshow right next to us, I got basketball that I'm thinking about. So let's talk a little bit of basketball. I got 3 big questions. They're not the biggest questions of Pitt basketball, but just 3 questions that sort of came to mind. Maybe 4, depending on how much time we have. We'll get into a few of these questions here. Just a couple topics, a couple questions on Pitt basketball as the 2024-25 regular season gets closer and closer. So let's talk a little Pitt hoops here on the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yes, the Wednesday edition of the Morning Pitt, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. This is the day of the week where you get a lot of youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com that you want to keep up with. You get the Morning Pitt here in the morning to get your day started. We'll have Pitt football coach and player interviews later this afternoon. It'll be here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And then tonight's I almost said the live post-game show. It's a live show, the live Panther-Lair show at 8:30 tonight. Me and Jim Hammett get together and talk everything in Pitt sports. We'll talk about Pitt football in this game against Cal. We'll talk a little Pitt hoops, I'm sure. We'll talk about everything going on with comments and questions from you. So make sure you tune in tonight, 8:30 to 9:30, 1 hour of Pitt sports talk on the live Panther-Lair show. And it's right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. You want to make sure you don't miss it. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com is the place to get all the Pitt video content. And, of course, we always ask you to like this video. And in the meantime, check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, for all the Pitt sports coverage you can possibly handle. Football, basketball, recruiting, everything else going on in the world of Pitt sports, plus, of course, message boards to interact and hang out with other Pitt fans all day, every day. Right there, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com for all the Pitt coverage. So, Pitt basketball. Got, 3, 4, 5 questions that are on my mind. And they're not necessarily the biggest questions facing Pitt this season. Like when we inevitably write a preseason content item that's like the 5 biggest questions facing Pitt, we may or may not touch on some of these topics. I don't know if these are the biggest questions. They're just 5 questions, or 3 or 4, depends on how much time we have. Questions that were just sort of on my brain when I came out of yesterday's press conference with Jeff Capel, some things I was thinking about. And I wasn't just thinking about them yesterday. It's stuff we've been thinking about and talking about all offseason, different things as far as this team and what they're going to look like and how they're going to play and what they're going to do and how far they're going to get. And I'm of the mind that they're going to play pretty well and they're going to get pretty far. I think this team could be really good for a lot of reasons. And not the least of which is I think it might be the most balanced team Jeff Capel has had since he got to Pitt. I mean, really, like front to back. I mean, he had a few teams that were balanced front to back, and they weren't really very good in the front or the back. This is more a matter of, a talented team, a good team that I think is really balanced front to back in the way they can attack you, the way they can go at you. I think three-point shooting is going to be interesting to watch. I think it's going to be interesting to see who develops or who emerges as the main three-point shooters there. But just like how when you went from 2 years ago to last season, there's a question of how you're going to replace all this three-point shooting from Greg Elliott and Nelly Cummings and how are you even Nike Sabandi to some extent. It was like, well, it's not going to be one guy. It's going to be a group effort. Blake Hinson will still lead the charge, but it'll be a group effort to sort of fill in behind him. Now you don't have Blake Hinson. I don't think you're going to have a Blake Hinson. I don't think you're going to have one guy who makes that many three-pointers, who takes that many three-pointers. But I think you'll have a collection of guys who all take a lot of three-pointers and make a lot of three-pointers. I think Jaylen Lowe, Ishmael Leggett, these guys can shoot from three. Guillermo Diaz-Graham can shoot from three. Amsal Delilich can shoot from three. Zach Austin can shoot from three, and I thought he had probably his best shooting stretch of the season in the final 5 or 8 games or whatever it was. We had that stat where he shot like 50% from three over the final, I forget what the number was, 5 games, something like that last season. So he's a threat there. Cam Corrin can probably step out and knock down a shot or two. It'll be a group effort. I don't think there'll be one guy who makes 200 threes or 100 threes or whatever it was, like they had last year with Blake Hinson. I don't think they're going to have that, but they'll have, not to use the word again, but a balanced, sort of attack of shooters out there who can knock down threes, in addition to maybe having a greater variety of scoring abilities. From the guards to the wings to the forwards and the centers, I think you have a lot of guys who can score in different ways, and maybe a greater variety of scoring than what we saw from this team a year ago. Just adding in the post presence alone with Cam Corrin as opposed to Federico, that alone is a real change in the ways they can attack. So this is all a long-winded way of saying I think they're going to be very good. And I don't think I'm alone in that regard. I think a lot of Pitt fans and people who observe this team think they're going to be pretty good and have some pretty high expectations for this team. And I think that applies to Jeff Capel and his staff and the players. I think there are some high expectations for this team this season. And of course, there'll be a lot of elements that go into that. But I think when you look at where they are and who they are and what they've got and who they return and who they brought in, they look pretty good going into the season. I think if there's one guy that the focus is on more than anyone, other than Amsal Delilich, of course, it's Jaylen Lowe, right? As the returning point guard, a guy who moved into the starting lineup at midseason and just was such a key piece, was such a facilitator for his teammates and a guy who was able to score, who was able to drive, the left-handed drives and the finishing at the hoop and then the shooting from outside and his facilitating for his teammates. I mean, Jaylen Lowe was a revelation. Bub Carrington was a full season revelation. Jaylen Lowe was a second half revelation, and they both had a huge amount to do with the success that Pitt enjoyed last year. Now Jaylen Lowe is coming back as a sophomore, and I expect to see a pretty big step forward for him, not just in terms of his level of play, not just in terms of his leadership, not just in terms of his confidence, but all of those things. I think he's going to look like a far more confident, in-control player, and he was already pretty confident and in control last season. There's an interesting debate that's been going on the message boards, and it started off as just a little back and forth with a couple of people, and I think it's become sort of a bit of a meme on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com about whose team is it? Whose team is this? Is it Jaylen Lowe's or is it Ishmael Leggett's team? And I think it's interesting. Very clearly last year was Blake Hinson's team. I think the year before you could say it was probably Jamarius Burton's team. Nelly Cummings right there with him, but I think it was Burton's team. Last year it was Hinson's team. Whose team is it this year? If Bub Carrington had come back, I would say it would be his team. But without Carrington, you're looking for someone, I think, without Carrington and Hinson, I think you're looking for someone to really step into that void, not just as the top stat producer, not just as the leading scorer like those guys were, the leading, numbers guy, but as someone who puts up the numbers and has the play on the court, and then also is the leader of the team off the court, the guy who can really pull the team together. I'm of the mind it's Jaylen Lowe, partially because he's the point guard. And I think when you're the point guard, there's something extra that goes along with that. On all but the rarest of teams, like last year's team, to and I guess Jamarius Burton technically wasn't the point guard, but still, I think, the point guard is usually the leader. I think he's usually the guy who's running things, who keeps things organized on the court, who is the voice of the team. In the locker room, the guy who speaks above the rest and can kind of call people together. And I think they'll have a variety of leaders on this team. I think they'll have a group of players who emerge as leaders. I think Lowe will be one. I think Leggett will be one. I think a guy like Guillermo Diaz-Graham and probably Jorge as well will be one. I think Damian Dunn is a guy that Jeff Capel brought up yesterday as an interesting guy, a new guy, a guy who just arrived on campus, but he comes from two other programs, so he's seen a lot of college basketball, and his most recent program was one of the most successful programs in the country at Houston, where certainly there's a culture of success and a culture of winning and accountability, and the kind of thing that I think most programs are trying to emulate. Most programs would like to have some of the elements that Houston has in building the success that they've built. And so Damian Dunn brings some of that, and I think the coaching staff is expecting him to bring some of that leadership and some of what he learned. They're expecting him to bring some of what he learned about defense from Houston, but I think they're also expecting him to bring some of what he learned about leadership and culture in the locker room from Houston. And so I think they're expecting him to share that with some of the other players and be one of those voices, one of those leadership voices in the locker room. So I think there's a variety of guys who can do it, but to me, it all sort of revolves around Jaylen Lowe. I do expect him to be this team's leading scorer. I do expect him to lead this team in assists, obviously. I do expect him probably to lead this team in minutes played. But I also expect him to be a pretty clear leader for this team. I expect him to have, maybe even more confidence than he had a year ago, more self-assuredness. I think you come into college basketball, even if you're or college sports just in general, even if you're a really accomplished player and successful player, you still come in and have to kind of find your place and find your voice with a new roster. And Jeff Capel actually had a quote yesterday where he said that he feels like Jaylen Lowe is aware of his status. And I thought that was really interesting. I put the quote on the message boards as I was live posting Jeff Capel's press conference. I want to find this quote. Quote, he understands his status on the team. He also said, quote, he's finding his voice as a leader. But that quote of he understands his status on the team really stuck out to me because I think it says a lot about where Jaylen Lowe is with this team, where the coaches see him with this team, and where he understands his place to be with this team. And I think he understands his place with this team. As Capel said, he understands his status with this team at the top of the pyramid. I think it's Jaylen Lowe's team. I think he's going to be the leader for this team. I think Ishmael Leggett is going to play a gigantic role for sure, and a lot of guys are going to play big roles, but this is Lowe. This is Lowe's team, and for at least one more year, he's going to be a big part of this team and this program. The other thing I found myself thinking about a lot coming out of yesterday, and it's connected to what I just said about Jaylen Lowe, is the guards overall. I'm really intrigued by this year's group of guards. I think, you look at the last two seasons, both very successful seasons. Obviously, 2 years ago, they make the tournament. Last year, they didn't. But both very successful seasons, both with very different groups of guards, very different types of guards. And I shouldn't say very different types of guards. I mean, that's true. But it's more about the group as a whole. The collective group of guards 2 years ago with Jamarius Burton and Nelly Cummings and Greg Elliott and Nike Sabandi, as opposed to last year's group of guards with really Bub Carrington, Jaylen Lowe, and Ishmael Leggett. It's a very interesting contrast. On one hand, obviously you have Burton and Cummings and Sabandi and Elliott. They're all seniors. They're all veterans. They've all been around for a long time. Burton and Sabandi had been at Pitt for a while. Cummings and Elliott coming in as transfers, having played for 4 or 5 years of college basketball. I mean, these were guys who had been around a long time. They were grizzled veterans with tons of experience, who knew the game, who understood the game and how to play and how to win and how to be part of something, how to be part of a team. And they brought that and they really imparted it on the rest of the team and really created that culture in the locker room, which I think is not unimportant, because I think what they created, and I think it was largely created by those guys in addition to Blake Hinson and the twins, the Diaz-Graham twins, but what was really created by Jamarius Burton, Nelly Cummings, Nike Sabani, and Greg Elliott, and probably in that order of priority, what was created by those guys was a culture that didn't just exist and serve as a catalyst for that team's success, but it was strong enough that it was planted as sort of a seed that took root and lived on in the next year's team, in last year's team. And I think it's really interesting because you had so many new faces. You lost so many of those key guys. You didn't have Burton or Cummings or Sabandi around anymore, and yet the culture survived. The culture transferred and continued living with last year's team. And so you get this new set of guards that come in because all of those guards were gone. You have a whole new set of guards come in, and what you have is 2 true freshmen and another transfer, a guy who comes in from Rhode Island. And you were going to have Dior Johnson, but obviously that didn't work out. So you go from 4 5th and 6th year players to 2 true freshmen and a transfer from Rhode Island. Completely different type of guard sets. You know what I mean? Like completely different types of groups there. And the results, it's very different. They play differently. They score differently. They defend differently. They succeed in different ways. They have different roles, but they both end up being really successful. You know what I mean? That group of Burton, Cummings, Sabandi, and Elliott was pretty awesome in the way they played. And the group of Carrington, Lowe, and Leggett was pretty awesome in the way they played. And they were very different. It was a considerable contrast, but the results were all pretty outstanding. Obviously, last year's team didn't make the tournament again, but I think it was a pretty successful season with a whole lot of winning, a whole lot of really strong play, and it was pretty fun to watch for a lot of it, okay? And it was very different types of guards. And then you go forward to this year, and now you don't have the bunch of 5th and 6th year guys. You also don't have a bunch of true freshmen and a transfer. What you've got is two returning guys, right? 2 returning, 1 starter returning, 1 guy who was a 6th man of the year. And then you bring in a veteran in Damian Dunn, a guy who's been around for a long time and has a lot of success and experience in college basketball. And you bring in this really highly touted, exciting freshman in Brandon Cummings. And so you really have like a third different type of guard group here. And this is to say nothing of the personal skill sets, but just in terms of experience, what they bring to the table and kind of who they are. And you could really say, when you look at like roles and sort of the place on the team, the status on the team, again, like I say, Burton and Cummings were like the leaders of that team 2 years ago. The guards weren't the leaders of the team last year. They were important players, big-time players, starters, major contributors and all of that, but they weren't the leaders, not in the way Burton and Cummings were. Hinson was. Well, now it's shifting back to the backcourt. Now that is where the leadership is. That is where the team is taking its cues. That is where the players who are going to set the tone for the team inhabit. And so I think it's interesting to see that again. And it's different kinds of players. There's probably, in terms of skill sets, this year's guards are probably closer to the guards from 2 years ago. You know what I mean? Like Damian Dunn has drawn and will continue to draw a lot of comparisons to Jamarius Burton, mostly due to his physicality. And he's kind of built like Burton a little bit. I think Ishmael Leggett has some Nike Sabandi to him. Not quite the athleticism that Nike Sabandi had, although he still gets a lot of like chaos points, a lot of offensive rebound, put back type of things, driving into contact, reckless, no concern for his physical well-being whatsoever. I think that was the way Sabandi played. He played like his hair was on fire, and I think Ishmael Leggett plays that way as well. I don't know if there's really a Greg Elliott clone in this group. I think Jaylen Lowe has some Nelly Cummings elements, certainly in his willingness and ability to put the team on his back and make plays when they need a play to be made. I think he's quicker than Nelly Cummings. I think he's a better athlete than Nelly Cummings, and I think he's a little better at finishing around the rim. or near the basket than Nelly Cummings was, because neither one of those guys is really getting all that close to the rim. And so there's a little bit, it's a little similar. It's more similar to the last year's group, or to 2 years ago, than what we saw, than last year's group, even though there's two guys from this year who were on that team last year. But I think it's sort of similar in that regard. And then you have this freshman, Brandon Cummings, who doesn't really have like an analog. I mean, he doesn't have an avatar or whatever you want to call it. He's just an exciting guy. And like, if you didn't have the returning starting point guard, the returning sixth man of the year who still played 30-plus minutes, and this, sixth-year, fifth-year transfer or whatever he is, Damian Dunn, of coming in from Houston, if just one of those guys were not part of the equation, Brandon Cummings would probably be average, the kind of guy who averages 25, 28 minutes per game. I think he might be that good as a freshman. His only limitation might come from the fact that there are three really good veteran guards playing around him. But he's going to be out there. I think he's going to be in the mix, and it's going to be more of a four-guard rotation than we saw a year ago, which I think is pretty exciting, because I think all the different personnel combinations and ways you could stack this lineup, we could do a whole episode on that. You know what I mean? Of like the 6 or 7 different legitimate combinations we could see. Or I should say the 6 or 7 different combinations we could legitimately see. And I'm pretty excited to see how all of that plays out. I mean, you've got guys like Zach Austin and Amsal Delilich that could move through 2, 3 different positions. In the case of Delilich, maybe even 4 different positions. Obviously Guillermo Diaz-Graham has position versatility. I think you can move guys around. You can go with a lot of lineups. You can go small. You can go big. You can go fast. You can go slightly less fast. You can go shooting. You can go banging. I think you can do a lot of stuff. I don't like saying you can go shooting, you can go banging. That's not really what I meant. You could play finesse or physical. How about that? That's probably a nicer way to say that. There's a lot that they can do. And I think it's going to be pretty exciting to see the different combinations Jeff Capel goes with. If we know anything about Capel, eventually he'll settle into a pretty short rotation. And I know every year we say this, I just don't know how they're going to shorten up this bench. It seems like they got to go at least 10 deep every game. And eventually they get down to like 7 or 8 deep, in some games 6. So I know we say that every year, but I'm going to be honest, right now, it's hard to see it. Because I think there's a lot of guys on this team who can play and help them win a lot of games in the ACC. So I think this is going to be an exciting season. I think the preseason should be a place for a lot of hype and excitement. And I think people, are rightfully looking forward to it. I know I am, and it's unfortunate we still have to wait a couple more weeks. Although 2 weeks from yesterday, they'll play that Point Park exhibition game. So you get to see the team in action less than 2 weeks from now. So we got that to look forward to, which is nice. Although no Amsal Delilich, so takes a bit of the shine off. Really does. All right, back to football talk tomorrow, but it was a lot of fun talking a little hoops today. Of course, we'll have a lot of football talk tonight on the Panther-Lair show live here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com at 8:30 p.m. Looking forward to that for sure. Can't wait to have you join us. It'll be a lot of fun. So thanks for tuning in today. Make sure you like this video and subscribe. youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We'll see you with a live show tonight. And then again tomorrow morning for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.